If you're not mad about ads, and that's fair enough, choose the David McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts, and you can hear this podcast in all its glory without the ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. I hope all is well. I hope you're enjoying the uncharacteristic sunshine in Ireland that we have been blessed with for the last week. I have become the resident crab, slightly pink.
It's glowing.
Glowing.
It's like radioactive here.
Yeah, exactly. You could actually heat a small house from my face. Okay, if you just, a whole community could be heated. But I am well, John. How are you this morning?
I'm good. And on that note, I have to admit, my buns are a little sore.
Oh, listen, this is very interesting. You were in unusual positions last night?
Well, yesterday I did a massive walk over mountain and hill, down to valley and lakes and all that.
Look at you sounding like Keats there, you are. Exactly.
Yeah, I did about a 22, 23 kilometre walk, and it was
That's
fantastic.
pretty impressive.
It's just I haven't done that in so long that I'm feeling...
How's the knee?
Knee's not bad, and I'm kind of happy with that.
So you're up the Dublin Mountains, were you?
Up the Dublin Mountains into a bit of Wicklow and back again.
That's lovely.
It was fantastic. And do you know what there is out there?
What is there out there, John? What is there out there?
This year, and it's becoming a bit of an issue, is there's an explosion in the population of deer. Now, we were talking about mink last week, but it's deer this week.
By the way, this is a zoological program. It's nothing to do with economics. This is like animal magic.
Yes.
Remember that program when we were kids?
Oh, yeah. But they're talking about doing a cull of the deer, which seems a bit... Because there's too many. There are too many. They have been protected for ages, but they kind of invade farmland and
farmers get pissed off.
Yeah, they do. In fairness, they do. But also there was at one stage a few years ago, and there's a little aside, a few years ago.
John's little aside, just put on the kettle there, make yourself a cup of tea, I'll be back in 5 minutes.
But there was a real issue with poaching. Fellas going out and shooting deer, bringing them back, skinning them up and selling them off as meat into the Dublin markets.
No way.
Yeah. And I did a documentary.
A deer steak.
Venice, yeah. But I did a documentary a few years ago with this nun who
The deer hunter.
who became a park ranger, and she got a license for a gun, so she was known as the nun with the gun.
Oh, this is in Ireland.
Oh yeah, living up there on the Sandy Gap. It's amazing. It's a great story. That's another
That is a good story. I like that one. A nun patrolling in the full habit.
Yeah. I'm not sure about that. Actually, that'd be great.
Do you remember?
Or a camouflage habit.
But do you remember, that reminds me of, did you ever see that Ben Affleck movie about South Boston? I think it was called Southie, or The Town.
Yes.
Where they actually had nun masks when they took... This is my head is going mad. When they actually... When the gangsters robbed the bank, they robbed it with nun masks, which are really terrifying. And now you've put that image in my head of a deer. It's the deer hunter. It's Robert De Niro, a nun, Ben Affleck, and an AK-47.
The nun with the gun.
The nun with the gun. Anyway, we get back to economics, Johnny boy. Get back to economics.
Oh.
What is taxing you today? What is on your mind?
Well, I've just been browsing the papers as I do.
Exactly.
I browse Macca reads. But no, I was looking at a few things. Like, all eyes are on the US Fed at the moment.
Yes.
You know, with inflation and the debt ceiling and the this and the that. There's loads of stuff going on. But the general thrust of the stories this week was on the Fed maintaining and increasing the interest rates.
Yes.
And I'm curious, it throws up a whole load of questions, but what's going on and where might that lead to?
Okay.
Ultimately, what's next?
You're really in the politics of money, John. So to answer the first question is, why are interest rates going to stay higher for longer? It is because the American economy is refusing to have a recession. Okay?
Yes.
Now, you imagine this. The Fed is trying to engineer a recession to get inflation down. And it's as if the economy is now saying, no, fuck off, we're not having it.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I say no.
No. So basically what you're finding in the United States is the economy is continuing to grow.
Yeah.
Employment is continuing to grow. Wages are continuing to grow, particularly for people at the poorer end. Wages are continuing to grow. So the Americans' economy is kind of saying to the Fed, we're not having it, right? So this produces a problem for the Fed, because they would have thought that had they raised interests from 0 to 5, which is where they're more or less going, right, this would have precipitated a recession quick enough, inflation would come down, and we'd be now in probably an interest rate cutting cycle. Had
Right.
you thought about this 18 months ago?
Yeah.
What is happening is the economy in the United States, for a variety of reasons, is unbelievably robust. It's not having it, right? So the Fed is now kind of stuck, which is we got to keep interest rates higher for longer. Now, of course, where that really squeezes is on financial markets that have leveraged themselves enormously, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about this all the time, right? They have various different ways of financing, but their assumption was that interest rates would remain quite low. And if they went up, they'd come down quickly. Now, this is not the case. So the way in which you look at it is, why is the Fed so important? Because, and this is an interesting point, up until now, the United States government has never defaulted, right?
Yeah.
And this goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton,
Yeah.
okay? Alexander Hamilton in 1792 introduced something called the Coinage Act, which established the dollar as the legal currency of the United States. He also introduced the first collective American government bond, right? So if you imagine before the revolution in America, right? All these various states were issuing their own debts, right? Because it was a federal structure.
Yeah.
And some states overspent, some underspent. I believe the states in the southern part of the states, Carolina, those sort of states, overspent,
Yeah.
right? And Connecticut underspent. So there was a big problem in the United States. How do you get rid of all this debt
Yeah.
and put it into one debt? And what Hamilton said is that we're going to amalgamate all these debts of all the states into one federal debt, right? And we're going to pay it at par. And the reason this was important is at the time, everybody thought these American states would default. So the paper, the actual IOUs, were trading at very, very deep discounts. Now, Hamilton said, no, we're going to pay everything at par, right? And we're never going to default.
Right.
So what that meant was that over the last couple of 100 years, the United States has built up a credibility of not defaulting. Now, that means that the risk-free return in the world is the long-term rate of interest on American debt, right? And the reason it's risk-free is because the Americans will never default. This is quite funny when we're talking about these default debts and all these things, right?
Yeah.
They will never actively default, right? So as a result of that, the American 30-year bond rate is regarded as the long-term risk-free rate. And every single investment has to be discounted by the American long-term bond rate in order to see whether or not your investment is real or not.
Okay.
So then it constitutes the floor of the monetary world. That's why the Fed is so important, because if it changes interest rates, it adjusts the long-term risk-free rate of investment, and therefore every asset in the world has to readjust up or down based on it. So when they raise interest rates, asset prices fall. When they cut interest rates, asset prices rise. That's a simple equation.
Right. Okay.
And this goes all the way back to Hamilton.
Yeah.
In fact, the Bank of England, I was reading last night about the Barings crisis of 1892, right?
That sounds like a humdinger.
Oh, I'm telling you, this is the sort of thing I'm sitting there. I'm a great dinner party conversationalist, right? He's over in the corner. But
It's over the corner reading.
exactly. You don't talk to your man. No, there's something I was reading. And do you remember the Bank Barings? Remember Nick Leeson?
I do, yeah.
So Nick Leeson destroyed Barings in, I think, about 1997 or 8.
Yeah.
But that was only the second time Barings had destroyed itself. It destroyed itself in 1892 because it was the huge lender to Argentina. And Argentina was sucking in huge amounts of cash from England, right? And of course, the Bank of England raised rates for longer than people expected in 1892. All the investments in the world had to re-rate themselves. All those investments in far-flung places like Argentina suddenly began to look more dodgy. Everybody thought that Barings had been actually just broking the debt, had been saying, we're going to sell a bit of Argentinian railways to our investors. They hadn't been. They'd been putting it on their own books, which is exactly what Nick Leeson did.
Okay.
And then when the Bank of England, which was the global equivalent of the Fed back then, raised interest rates, suddenly, to use the expression from Warren Buffett, the tide went out and everybody saw who was swimming in the nude, and who was swimming in the nude was Barings Bank.
Right.
So this was what I was reading.
Yeah.
But it's the same mechanism. It's amazing that finance, although it has changed profoundly in the last 100 years, really at the end of it, it's still the same. So somebody sets this risk-free rate. And from there, everything flows. I've always thought the best way to look at this is, because this is the way you and I have been brought up, champagne pyramids, John.
Oh, yes.
Right.
indeed.
Okay, imagine a really swanky wedding. And there is was it called the Jeroboams? What are they called, the big things of champagne?
I wouldn't know, Mark. I never got to that level.
Nor did I. I so wouldn't know. I don't even know the word, right? It's like something like that, right? But imagine a champagne pyramid. So the champagne's flowing at the top, and then it percolates down into the next layer of glasses, into the next layer of glasses, the next layer of glasses.
Just when you say that, I just remember the images of George Best doing that in the pub.
Did
Do you
Georgie
remember
do that?
He did that, and it was.
Where did it all go wrong, Georgie?
Go on.
One of the finest. One of the finest.
Absolutely.
Okay. So imagine a champagne pyramid, right? Imagine the Fed is the bottle of champagne.
Yeah.
So they're pouring the champagne in, and the money is flowing like champagne all the way. As long as you keep pouring money in at the top, right? All that champagne eventually gets down to the bottom, right?
Yeah.
So imagine the top of the pyramid are the best assets.
Yeah.
But the bottom of the pyramid are the really dodgy ones. When money is flowing, even the dodgy ones at the very, very bottom get financed.
Yeah.
When you stop the money flowing, the ones at the bottom run out of cash earliest, and the ones at the top continue to be full, right?
Yeah.
So when interest rates are low, the money is flowing. When interest rates are high, the money stops flowing. So therefore, everybody re-rates everything.
Okay.
And so when the Fed says, as it did this week, we're going to keep interest rates higher for longer, what they're basically saying is we're going to make sure that money doesn't flow for the next few months.
Yeah.
And therefore, all those assets at the bottom, which are now desperately looking for cash to refinance, can't find any cash because there is no cash out there.
Right. Okay.
And so those debts, and this is why people worry about debts. So those assets quickly become debts. People who were, what we talked about, mezzanine finance last week, this sort of middle grade finance, people who've been running their shop based on the following. I'm trading well, I'm generating income, I'm buying other assets, I'm expanding, right? And I'm playing the interest rate market. And this is a huge part of it. When companies expand, and this is why so many of the tech companies are laying off people.
Yeah.
When companies expand, they do it largely through the seat of their pants.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's a fake it till you make it job, right?
Yeah,
That's the right. So they're expanding, they're buying other companies, they're issuing debt, they're issuing paper, but it's all predicated on the ability to refinance everything. Now, if you decide that you're refinancing at 3% and then suddenly you've got to refinance 5%, that discount rate we talked about changes and the value of all your assets fall. And that's the big fear. Because basically what you have is this money flows all around the world. So everybody takes their lead from the Fed. And bizarrely, when the Fed raises interest rates, even mafiosi type companies end up having to pay attention because money becomes tighter. And when money becomes tighter, all those investments or those spendings that looked fine about 3 or 4 years ago don't look half as fine. So you got to raise money from other areas.
Okay, Mac, Jesus.
I can say, by the way, this is going to be a bit of an economics tutorial. I can see it in John's head.
Yeah, I have me notes
I
out.
know.
Pen in
It's
hand.
always terrifying.
No, but I was doing some more reading, as I was
Go
saying,
on.
during the week. And I came across a whole bunch of new terms that I've no idea about, which I want to ask you
Okay,
about
go
to
for it.
explain after this.
Grant.
So, Mike, we're talking about the Fed, we're talking about interest rates, we're talking about inflation.
Talking about
and-
recessions. We're
Yeah.
talking about things breaking.
Yes, all that stuff. But like I was saying, there's a few new terms that I need some explanation on so I can understand the rest of it.
Yes.
And that was things like a natural interest rate. What is the natural interest rate? Or even another term was the neutral interest rate.
Okay, let's come back. Let's as the Americans say, let's back up a bit. So the big question for financial markets, for people looking at the economy, for people investing, for people employed, for everybody, right, is yes, we know that American interest rates have gone up to close to 5%.
Yeah.
But just how tight is monetary policy? So there's lots of things going on, right? So is that extremely tight? Is that half tight? Is that loose? What does that 5% say to us,
Right.
right? And in order to figure that out, you've got to go back and say, is there a natural rate of interest? Now, this might
Okay.
Seem bizarre to people that John's face is looking very quizzical here, right? So the natural, these are really important things because policy is only tight or loose if it deviates from what would be regarded as a natural rate. So the natural rate of interest is the rate of interest where all the demand in the economy and all the supply in the economy equals each other, right?
Okay.
So when the economy is moving at an average pace, like a growth rate, what on average is the interest rate that pertains to that growth rate? So it means where does the match between the savings of the economy and the investment of the economy meet? So basically, if you think about the rate of interest, it's the price of time. It's the price of money and the price of time.
Okay.
So if there's a huge demand for money and a very little supply of money, the price of money goes up, right?
Okay.
If, on the other hand, there's a huge supply of money and there's a little demand, the price of money goes down. So you've got to figure out what is the natural rate, right, at which the economy has no tendency to change. The natural rate in the United States has come down dramatically over the last 40 years from about 4% to about 1%. Now, the question is, why is that?
Yeah, why is that?
The first one is...
Good question, Magger.
Yes, exactly. Why is that? The first one is a prolonged absence of inflation over the last 40 years.
Right.
So basically, the Fed has been on a downward trajectory, right? Okay, that's the first thing. But the second thing, more interestingly, is the mismatch between savings and investments in the United States.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that the United States runs a current account deficit, which should be suggestive that the United States is a non-saving economy, right? What you find is that the pool of savings in the United States has expanded quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And the rate of interest applying to this pool of savings is dictated by how much of those savings are being used in the economy every day.
Okay.
And what you find is that...
In other loans.
In other loans, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, this is the equilibrium rate of interest.
Yeah.
And what you find is that over the last number of decades, the amount of money available to the United States has increased quite dramatically. And where does that money come from? Some of it's come from China, from the big savers around the world.
Okay.
So you've got these big saving countries around the world, China being a very, very good example. But there's lots of other ones, the sort of the sovereign wealth funds of those extraordinary rich Gulf states, etc., have become savers. Europe has become savers. Now, why would America become more saving orientated? Because it's getting older, right?
Okay.
Right? And older people save and younger people spend.
Yeah.
So the demographics of the United States are tending towards lower long-term interest rates or natural interest rates. So that's the natural rate of interest has actually fallen. So if you take, for example, the big problem in the United States now demographically, they talk about the end of the boomer generation. So the big baby boom of the 1950s is beginning to dissipate. Those people were at their peak spend in probably the 1990s, the 1980s, 1990s, because they were younger. Okay, they're in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? They are now all in their 70s, the boomers. You look at the Bill Clintons, these sort of generation.
Yeah.
They're saving, right?
Yeah.
And the American demographics has changed, so there aren't another...
Look at the saving for it. They can't take it with them.
Because Yanks are like that. Exactly. Right? Yanks are like that. But you look at all older people save.
Yeah.
They save themselves privately. They save publicly. Or pensions are... What are pensions other than basically the notional savings of older people? So basically...
But also to pass on, I suppose.
To pass on, they have assets, they have houses, they have all these assets built up. So they've all these saving vehicles built up, right? As the Americans get older, the rate of interest associated with America falls because they're saving more, right? If the United States were to have a baby boom now and was to replicate, for example, what you saw in the 1950s and 1960s, interest rates would go higher in about 10 years' time.
Right.
But that doesn't look to be the case. The only baby boom they're having is through immigration.
Yeah.
So the first thing is the natural rate of interest has fallen to around 1 or 1.5%. So that's the rate at which the economy is in equilibrium, according to this theory. So then you got to say, if the natural rate is about 1, this is called the R star, right? And this is what has been annoying you.
Yes,
right?
that's another one of those terms that popped out.
Yeah.
And I know, Jesus,
So the R star, if it's about 1 or 1.5%, then the Fed funds rate today, which is at 5.25%, means that monetary policy is extremely tight in America. The Fed is really squeezing because the natural rate is 1 or 1.5%. The actual rate is 5.25% and maybe going higher. So there is a massive monetary squeeze going on in the States.
Okay.
Now, typically, as I said before, this would have led to lower inflation, and they could bring the rate of interest down. So the gap between the real rate, the actual rate, and the natural rate was smaller. Right? This is the stuff I did all my life, John. It's really...
Yeah.
I know, I'm just looking at you, you're thinking, oh man, right?
No, this is good stuff. This is good stuff.
So, the first thing we can say is, what is the likelihood of things to break? It is made much more likely if the distance between the natural rate of interest and the actual rate of interest is significant, which is where we are now. So number one, things will break in the States.
Okay, when you say break, how do you mean?
I mean, companies will go bust. I mean, financial markets will fall. I mean, real estate will collapse. Or not collapse, real estate will...
You mean recession?
They will get a recession, right? So basically what you're having is the real rate is very, very tight.
But as you just said earlier in the podcast that, you know, the economy is refusing to go into recession.
It's given...
But, like, why?
Either, and if I was a really typical blackboard economist, right, which I am not, the blackboard economist would say, well, the theory says this should happen, and if it doesn't happen, there's a problem with reality, right?
Yes,
Whereas I always say, if reality is giving us a different indicator, there's a problem with the theory.
Yeah.
So it means your or star, take with a pinch of salt.
Right.
This is the economic theory.
Okay.
But you need theories to create anything, right?
Yeah.
Then there's a second thing called or double star, John.
Oh, be Jesus.
Exactly. That sounds very inventive, people who will not get jobs as copywriters. Okay. Right? An or double star is the natural rate of interest that incorporates the fragility of the economy to financial shocks. So what did I say? The first normal rate of interest is where real demand and real supply equal, right?
Yeah.
When you're buying real stuff.
Yeah.
Now superimpose on this financial shocks, right? As the United States becomes more financialized, it becomes more fragile. And the reason is the following.
Okay.
Periods of low interest rates. Do you remember our champagne pyramid? Periods of low interest rates mean very low returns. So low interest rates means low returns.
Yeah.
So what happens is initially companies and finances and banks and all these things say, oh, okay, we're fine. Asset prices go up. There's some capital gain, but in general, we're not getting low returns, but that's okay. And then they say, well, let's go looking for higher returns. So they begin to go out what I will call the deviant curve in economics, right? They begin to do unnatural acts, John. Right? Go back to your...
No, let's not go back there.
So they begin to do unnatural acts, right? Frame it in,
This is the cryptos, fellas.
All that space, right?
Right.
Yeah. That is the dark room of economics, right? Imagine a bathhouse.
Yeah.
We're in the dark room now, okay? And the reason those unnatural acts are done is because people are looking for a thrill.
Yes.
That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? I see through a very, very unidimensional me, right? So people are looking for thrill. So they're basically saying, that's not giving me enough yield. I'm not getting enough buzz off that shit, man. It's like drug taking, right? Just take 2, you'll be fine, right?
Give us a go with that GIMP mask.
Exactly. Give us a go with that GIMP mask is exactly right. So the GIMP mask, the financial equivalent of the GIMP mask, John, right, is all these dodgy investments over here, right? And what happens is that when you should be happy with plain vanilla, right? You get a little bit leery and you end up in your GIMP suit, right? And that means you end up investing in riskier and riskier and riskier assets.
Yeah.
Now, what that means your behavior is much more deviant, right?
Yeah.
And it means the financial system is much riskier because you're in the GIMP mask, right? When you were actually totally fine in the missionary position. Yeah. But now you're totally compromised, right?
Yeah.
So their or double star is the rate of interest, which is the natural rate of interest plus the rate of interest for financial deviancy, right? And that will always as well be either higher or lower than the natural rate. It's probably lower now. And the reason is, so the gap between the actual rate of interest at 5% and the or double star is greater because of the fragility inbuilt into the system, which means that the higher the rate of interest now, the more likely you are to have financial calamity in stocks, commercial real estate itself, and as you said, out into the more saucier end of the market as well.
Does that mean, I can't wait for the triple star to come along.
But that is the GIMP mask plus.
But does that mean that would solve a lot of the Fed's problems, does it?
Well, so the question then is, can the Fed, this comes back, the major question is, right, can the Fed achieve lower levels of inflation without a financial calamity? That's the key.
Yeah.
And that's the very tight rope that this particular GIMP is on, right?
Right.
Okay, this is the tightrope they're on, right? Now, of course, there's one other problem, which is that the economy is not deflating quick enough. So the economy, in a way, is putting up their two fingers to the Fed. So what you have, therefore, is the Fed is in a cul-de-sac. The more they raise rates, the larger the gap between these two or star and or double star and the actual rate of interest, meaning the tighter monetary policy is, meaning the more problematic it is to refinance all those loans that you took out 5 or 6 years ago.
Right. Okay.
Right? So that's the key. And the implication of all this is that it's taking the Fed much longer to get the rate of inflation down. Every single day is causing hurt in the financial system because every single day means you've got to pay back all the money you borrowed a couple of years ago, right? And you can't refinance it. So if you can't refinance it, what do? You go to your financiers and they say, well, what? I was going to refinance for 5% last year. I'm going to refinance for 9% this year, right? Now, most companies at that level don't have the revenue to actually tie themselves over. So what you're going to see is a massive fire sale of companies in the United States.
Right.
Because what will happen is financiers will say, I'll finance you, but you've got to give me equity. You've got to be part of the action.
Right.
So all the kind of vultures and sharks of the business are now beginning to circle again. And they're waiting for assets to fall and they're going to pick them all up. Because what they're going to do is they're just going to squeeze those guys and say, yeah, you need money. Well, look, man, money's expensive now. And the guy will say, well, look, I can't pay. They say, well, you know what you could pay? You could give me equity for your debt. So what they'll say is, I won't just lend you money. I'll lend you money. I'll charge you money and
a piece of the action.
I'll take a piece of the action.
Yeah.
So you're going to get this massive transfer of assets in the United States from the over-leveraged, over-borrowed economy to those sharks who are coming in and who are circling at the moment.
And is that just another or a greater concentration of wealth into a smaller and smaller group of
Or it could be
already wealthy people? The people with the money.
That's certainly going on. That's certainly going on. And that's where lots of people on the left will identify, look, I told you so, right? But what is also going on is ownership is changing all the time in the United States.
Yeah.
Right? But you are right. I mean, there's never been a better time to have money in your back pocket in the United States than now, right? Look at what's happened to all the tech companies. Look at all the layoffs in Dublin, right?
Yeah.
What's happening is all those companies that splurged in the last decade are now cutting back rapidly. And I mean, the tech shakeout in Dublin is significant.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the tech shakeout in San Francisco is even more dramatic. But what is happening is the Fed is in a cul-de-sac. They've increased interest rates. They hoped the rate of inflation would have come down quicker. It hasn't come down quick enough. That means that interest rates remain higher for longer. The people who really, really get squeezed are the people who have existing leverage and are trying to refinance everything. The people at the bottom of that champagne pyramid, they have nowhere to go except into the arms of financiers who are now going to take equity from them. And that will mean that lots and lots of businesses and lots of people who built up businesses for ages and ages and broke their ass are going to have to give the business and that effort and those brands to people who are sitting on the sidelines waiting for the carnage. And that's where we're going.
Jesus, Mark. But, okay, let's...
Is it the GIMP suit or the Fed that's annoying you more?
I find it very tight, actually. Anyway. No, I tell you, this is fascinating, but what about the politics of all this? Especially in America, it's so charged at the moment. And what if Biden turns around and says, hey, come here, Mr. Powell?
Yeah, you can't be precipitating a gratuitous recession.
Yeah.
Just because you can't get your R squares right or your R stars right.
I mean, and we spoke about this before, I was horrified when you told me that the Fed during inflationary times with full employment, what we're in now, that the Fed are trying to manufacture unemployment, job losses.
So yeah, right. There's a big political thing. So we forget that the Federal Reserve is a political organization. It is part of the American administration, right? And there has been a significant period of 3 or 4 decades where central bank independence has been the rallying call of all central bankers. And politicians have been saying, oh, yeah, okay, give it to them, right? Now we're in a situation which is much more akin to the early 70s than any other time.
Right.
So in the early 70s, Tricky Dicky Richard Nixon, the head of the Fed was a guy called Arthur Burns, right?
Yeah.
And Tricky Dicky said to Arthur Burns was increasing interest rates to try and wring inflation out of the American system in the very early 70s. And our friend Tricky Dicky took him aside and said, basically, mate, if you want to keep your job, you will cut interest rates, you won't increase interest rates, or you will stop increasing interest rates.
Right.
And Arthur Burns did just that. And it seemed to work for about a year or two, but then inflation became completely embedded in the American system. And by the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was the president.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Carter was trying to get inflation under control. He couldn't do it. He gets Paul Volcker to come in, and Paul Volcker puts interest rates up to 20%, right?
Right.
So the more and more you actually skirt around the issue of inflation now, the more you're postponing problems for the next administration. So to answer your question, is Joe Biden having conversations with Jay Powell? You can bet your arse he is.
Right.
Absolutely. Is he having it directly? Maybe not. He's probably using his Council of Economic Advisors.
Can you remember them?
Exactly. Black and tans. So the day we put black and tans.
Yeah, it's a great call.
So yeah, you're right. So there is an extra dimension here.
Yeah.
Which is the following. That the administration, i.e. the State Department, i.e. the Treasury, i.e. the President's, the White House, leans on the Fed to avoid the calamity that economic theory suggests is coming. They then sort of buckle under that pressure. The Fed do. They keep interest rates a little bit lower. They give Biden breathing space for a year or two to fight the next election. Inflation becomes embedded in the United States. Inflationary expectations change in the United States. Wage rates go up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you get much worse inflation down the road. And that's why I said they're in a cul-de-sac. And when you're in a cul-de-sac, the choices are never between good and bad, but they're between bad and worse. And that's what the Fed's facing.
Well, let me ask you one last thing then. On the European side, does the ECB follow suit, or is that a different...
ECB, the Europeans have a different structure of the economy. We have different levels of leverage. We have a much less significant inflation problem because it's really energy in Europe.
Yeah.
Whereas in the United States, it's real estate, it's wages, it's in the system. Whereas Europe, it's still a function of energy. But why don't we come back next week to discuss GIMPs or stars or double stars and all sorts of financial deviancy to take us out to the weird end of the market next week?